At the school gates, a harsh scene froze the morning air. The little girl, clutching her worn books and wearing a dress full of patches, lowered her gaze as her mother proudly adjusted the crisp uniform of her son. "Only your brother deserves something new," the woman declared, her finger pointing sharply. In that instant, Emily's heart sank, invisible to the very eyes that should have loved her most. What was about to unfold would not only challenge a mother's pride, but also reveal the true meaning of family. And before we continue, let me wish you peace and health. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? On a crisp Vermont morning, laughter filled Burlington's farmers market except for Emily Parker, whose faded dress made her blend into the crowd like a shadow. The September sun was gentle, filtered through the red and gold leaves that spun down from the maples lining Church Street. Stalls stretched in neat rows, covered with bright awnings that flapped softly in the breeze. The voices of vendors rose and mingled, offering everything from fresh cider to handmade scarves. The smell of cinnamon sugar donuts drifted through the air, blending with the sharper scent of cheddar cheese samples and roasted peanuts. Families strolled arm in arm, their conversations punctuated by bursts of children's laughter. Toddlers tugged at sleeves for caramel apples. Older children begged for woolen hats stitched with barriers. The whole market hummed with energy, a picture of small-town joy on a Saturday morning. Linda Parker moved through it with purpose. Her cranberry-colored coat swung neatly at her sides, and her polished boots tapped briskly on the cobblestones. She stopped at a stall and examined a navy blue jacket, her eyes lighting up as she held it against her son's shoulders. Michael, 12 and tall for his age, puffed out his chest as his mother admired him. "This one is perfect," Linda declared with satisfaction. The vendor, a gray-haired man with a friendly smile, nodded approvingly. "Fine choice, ma'am. That boy's got presence. With this jacket, he'll look like a young gentleman." Michael's grin widened as he ran his hands over the soft fleece lining. He caught his reflection in the small mirror hanging at the stall and lifted his chin, imagining himself walking into school, teachers nodding, classmates whispering with envy. Emily lingered a step behind. At 9, she was small and quiet, her posture folded inward as though she wished she could vanish among the bright autumn crowd. Her dress, once pink, had dulled into a tired beige after years of washing. The hem was uneven, the seams loose where other hands had patched them before passing the garment down to her. She tugged at the sleeve, embarrassed by the fraying threads, and kept her eyes low so no one would notice her. But then, something caught her. Just across the aisle, a stall draped in quilts and dresses swayed in the breeze. Among them hung a sky-blue dress, its fabric soft and new, embroidered with tiny flowers that shimmered when the sun struck them. Emily's breath caught. Slowly, almost shyly, she reached out, brushing her fingertips across the fabric. For a moment, she let herself imagine. She pictured walking into her classroom wearing the dress, her head held high, classmates pausing to look, not to laugh, but to smile. She imagined spinning once, the skirt fanning around her like the autumn leaves dancing on the wind. The thought filled her chest with warmth, a fragile spark of belonging. Her lips curved into a timid smile. But just as quickly, the spark was snuffed out. "Emily," Linda's voice cut sharply as she turned from admiring Michael. "That's not necessary. You still have your cousin's dress. That's enough." The words were quick, final. Linda's hand brushed the fabric aside as though Emily's longing were a nuisance. The vendor chuckled again, patting Michael on the shoulder. "He'll look sharp in this jacket, ma'am. You'll be proud." "I already am," Linda answered warmly, her eyes fixed on her son. Emily let her hand fall back to her side. Her cheeks burned as if someone had scolded her in public, though few had even noticed. She stepped back, clutching her backpack strap tighter, trying to shrink into the crowd so no one would see the tears threatening her eyes. Robert Parker, tall and broad-shouldered, stood nearby with grocery bags heavy in his arms. His face was worn, shadowed by years of work and quiet resignation. He saw Emily retreat from the dress, saw the disappointment flicker across her face. His lips parted, a protest rising in his throat. But the old habit of silence was stronger. His gaze dropped to the cobblestones, his voice swallowed before it could be heard. The market continued around them. A street musician played a tune on his accordion. Children clapped along as they danced near the fountain. The world moved forward, bright and joyful, as if unaware of the small girl walking just a little slower than the rest, folding her arms against the autumn chill, carrying a weight that no jacket could warm. Michael spun once in his new jacket, the fabric catching the pale sunlight. He grinned wide, clearly pleased with how it fit. Linda clapped her hands lightly, her eyes shining with pride. "Yes, son, this is how it should be," she said, her voice warm, almost indulgent. Emily, standing a few steps back, pressed her arms across her chest as the wind slipped through the thin fabric of her sweater. She hugged herself tightly, as though she might hold in the cold, or perhaps hold in the ache that swelled quietly inside. Around her, the laughter of other children rang out as they munched on candied apples and sipped from paper cups of hot cider. She longed to join them, to feel like she belonged in that world of simple joy. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, watching the cobblestones blur as she blinked away tears. Robert shifted the weight of his grocery bags, his brow furrowed. He noticed the way Emily's shoulders curled in, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. The silence he carried inside pressed hard against his chest. He could speak. He could say, "Let her have the dress." He could remind Linda that both children mattered. But silence, once chosen too often, becomes its own prison. And so he walked on, one step behind, his thoughts louder than any words he dared to speak. Vendors called out cheerfully as families passed. A woman waved a jar of golden honey, offering samples on wooden sticks. A young boy laughed as he chased his dog between the stalls, nearly tipping a basket of apples. The crisp autumn air was alive with energy, a small-town rhythm that wrapped others in comfort. But for Emily, every cheerful sound seemed distant, muffled, as if the world belonged to everyone but her. Michael caught his reflection again in a shop window and straightened proudly. He imagined the nods of approval from his classmates, perhaps even the admiring glance of a teacher. His mother's smile was proof enough that he mattered. Emily lingered behind, her steps dragging as though the cobblestones themselves pulled her down. She thought of the blue dress still swaying gently on the rack, its embroidered flowers catching the sunlight. For just a heartbeat, it had promised her something beautiful, something that belonged only to her. And now that it was gone, the emptiness weighed heavier than the backpack on her shoulders. She pressed her lips together, holding back the words that wanted to rise. Her chest tightened, and she whispered so softly that only the autumn breeze could carry it. Emily whispers to herself, "Why do I always get what's left behind?" Champlain Elementary bustled with life that mid-morning. The playground stretched wide, framed by a chain-link fence that rattled whenever the wind pushed through. The maple trees beyond were already shedding golden leaves, scattering them across the asphalt, where chalk lines for hopscotch and foursquare had been drawn and redrawn by eager hands. Children filled every corner with movement and sound. A group of boys shouted as they chased a scuffed soccer ball toward the far goalposts. Near the swings, girls braided each other's hair while trading stickers and secrets. The air smelled faintly of crayons and peanut butter sandwiches that had been unwrapped early. Teachers, bundled in fall jackets, stood in pairs at the edges, their conversations drifting between sips from dented thermoses of coffee. In the middle of this swirl of joy and chatter walked Emily Parker. She kept to the edges, hugging her notebook close to her chest, her faded dress swaying awkwardly as she moved. It was the same dress she had worn on Sunday at the market, its seams straining where they had been mended, its fabric dulled from too many washings. Against the bright ribbons, polished sneakers, and clean new jackets of her classmates, Emily's clothes whispered loudly of second-hand wear. She hoped, prayed that no one would notice her. She aimed her steps carefully, threading a quiet path along the wall of the school building. If she could just reach the far bench by the sandbox, maybe she could sit unseen until the bell rang. But playgrounds are places where eyes are sharp and whispers travel fast. 3 girls by the swing set caught sight of her. The leader, Clara, wore a brand new red ribbon tied into a perfect bow atop her ponytail. She tilted her head, smirk tugging at her lips. Leaning close to her friend, she stage whispered, just loud enough to carry. "Look at that dress," she said with mocking delight. "Doesn't it look like something you'd use to scrub the floor?" The second girl giggled, pressing a hand to her mouth as though embarrassed but unable to resist. The third chimed in, louder still. "My mom has a rag just like that for the kitchen counter." Their laughter rang out, cutting sharper than the autumn wind. Emily froze. Her chest tightened, breath shallow. Heat rose to her cheeks, hotter than the sun overhead. She tried to clutch the fabric at her waist, bunching it together as though she could hide the stains, the threads, the proof of her difference. But the more she pulled at it, the clearer it became, and the laughter swelled. Children nearby began to look over. Some joined in with snickers, while others turned away, pretending not to see. Indifference can sting as much as cruelty. Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but no words came. On the far side of the playground, Michael was chasing the soccer ball. He heard the burst of laughter, recognized his sister's small, shaky cry. For a second, his foot hovered above the ball, eyes flicking toward the crowd gathering near the swings. He saw Clara's bow glinting in the sunlight, heard Emily's muffled sob. A knot twisted in his stomach. But then one of his teammates shouted, "Pass, Michael! Over here!" The moment snapped. Michael turned back, kicking the ball with practiced force. He told himself he hadn't really heard anything, that maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Yet a shadow of guilt flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it came. Emily's tears finally spilled. She lowered her head, wishing the asphalt would open and swallow her whole. The laughter wrapped around her, louder, crueler, and she trembled in its grip. And then, a new voice, firm and steady, cut through the noise like a bell ringing at Sunday service. Enough. The playground fell into sudden stillness. The laughter, once sharp and triumphant, fizzled into awkward silence. Children shifted on their feet, looking around, pretending to be busy with their games. Clara's smile faltered, and she tugged at her ribbon as if it had suddenly grown too tight. Mrs. Johnson, tall and composed, stepped into the circle. Her gray wool coat hung open, revealing a simple blouse and skirt beneath. She wasn't shouting, she never had to. The authority in her voice came not from volume, but from conviction. "Stop this now," she said evenly, her gaze sweeping across the girls. The three lowered their eyes at once, cheeks pink with shame. They muttered half-formed excuses, but Mrs. Johnson's silence was louder than their words. They stepped back, dissolving into the crowd of children who suddenly found their games very interesting. Emily stood frozen, trembling. Her hands still clutched the fabric of her dress, knuckles white. She couldn't lift her gaze, couldn't trust her voice to say anything at all. Gently, Mrs. Johnson knelt, her coat brushing against the asphalt. She laid a steady hand on Emily's thin shoulder, her tone softening. "Emily," she whispered, just for the child to hear. "Don't let them make you feel less than who you are." The words, simple as they were, wrapped around Emily like a blanket. She nodded faintly, though tears still streaked her cheeks. She leaned against the teacher for just a moment, finding shelter in that closeness. The bell rang, calling the children back inside. Feet pounded across the playground, the air buzzing again with chatter and shouts as the incident faded quickly from most minds. But Mrs. Johnson couldn't forget, as she watched Emily shuffle back to her desk. Head bent low over her notebook, something stirred deep in her chest. She knew that silence had seen it before. Children carrying burdens too heavy for their age. That afternoon, when the final bell rang, students poured from the building in a rush of voices and backpacks. Emily, as always, was the last to leave. She gathered her notebooks carefully, stacking them as though they might break if she moved too fast. Outside, Robert Parker waited on a bench by the gate. His coat collar was turned up against the breeze, his hands buried in his pockets. When he saw Emily, he rose slowly, offered a faint pat on her back, and fell into step beside her. They walked down the tree-lined street, without speaking, the crunch of leaves underfoot their only conversation. Behind them, Mrs. Johnson stood in the doorway, her eyes following the pair until they vanished around the corner. Her instincts told her the problem didn't end at the playground. Emily's silence wasn't just shyness, it was a symptom of something deeper, something at home. That evening, as she packed up her papers and slid them into her leather bag, she made a quiet decision. She would not let this go. Mrs. Johnson knew then she had to act. The murmur of the playground still echoed in her mind, and she resolved quietly. She would visit the Parkers herself. The Parker home sat on a quiet street just a few blocks from downtown Burlington, a modest white clapboard house with green shutters that had long ago lost their shine. The yard was small, dotted with fallen leaves that gathered against the steps. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of boiled potatoes and the tick-tock of an old wall clock that seemed louder in the stillness of late afternoon. Robert sat at the kitchen table, a newspaper unfolded in his hands. His eyes moved across the print, but the words didn't land. He had been reading the same paragraph for nearly 10 minutes, his mind drifting elsewhere. Silence had become his refuge, but also his cage. Each time he looked up, he saw the faded curtains swaying slightly in the breeze, the chipped paint on the cabinets, the traces of a life lived carefully, never loudly. Linda moved briskly around the kitchen, clattering pans and muttering about the stew simmering on the stove. Her coat was already draped over a chair, her hair pinned perfectly even at home. She measured her worth in order and appearances. Her energy was focused on making sure Michael had what he needed, that Robert didn't interfere, that Emily stayed out of the way. Upstairs, Emily lay on her stomach across her small bed, a short pencil in her hand. She pressed hard against the page of her notebook, filling it with crooked lines of a drawing trees with orange leaves, a girl in a blue dress standing beneath them. She shaded the dress carefully, even though her pencil was nearly worn to nothing. The lines smudged easily, but she didn't care. The page was her refuge, a place where no one laughed, no one told her what she couldn't have. The sound of knuckles rapping against the front door startled the house. Robert looked up, frowning slightly. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour. He folded the paper slowly, rose, and shuffled toward the hallway. His footsteps were heavy on the wooden floorboards as he turned the knob. On the porch stood Mrs. Johnson. She wore her gray coat, buttoned against the cool wind, a leather folder tucked firmly under her arm. Her expression was calm but serious, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who had decided not to remain silent. "Good afternoon," she said gently. "I hope I'm not intruding." Robert blinked, surprised. He opened the door wider, hesitating before stepping aside. "Evening, ma'am." "No, come in." The house seemed to grow smaller as she entered. Linda appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her brows arched high at the unexpected sight of a teacher standing in her home. Still, she forced a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mrs. Johnson," Linda said, her tone light but edged. "What a surprise. Please sit." The teacher nodded, taking a chair across from Robert at the kitchen table. Linda settled across from her, folding her hands neatly, her chin tilted with quiet suspicion. From the hallway, Emily crept halfway down the stairs, her heart pounding. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. Mrs. Johnson rested her hands on the folder, her voice steady but soft. "I wanted to speak with you about Emily." The air tightened. Linda's smile thinned. Robert shifted in his chair. Upstairs, Emily clutched the railing, her pulse quickening. "She had a very difficult day at school," Mrs. Johnson continued. "During recess, some of the children mocked her clothes," she cried. "I had to step in." Linda gave a quick shrug, her voice clipped. "Children can be cruel. It happens. Builds character." Robert glanced at his wife, then back at the teacher. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. From the stairwell, Emily's eyes filled with tears. The words stung almost as much as the laughter had. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward slightly, her palms flat against the worn wood of the table. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. "It's not just about clothes, Mrs. Parker. It's about what they represent. Emily feels invisible, as though she is always the one left behind. That is a wound that can last far beyond childhood." Linda crossed her arms, her chin lifting higher. "Michael is the older child. He needs to look the part. It's not harmful for Emily to wear simple things. I grew up like that, and I turned out just fine." In the hallway, Emily pressed herself tighter to the wall, her small body rigid with the effort of staying silent. Each word from her mother was another stone placed on her chest. Robert cleared his throat, but before he could form a sentence, Linda's sharp glance cut him off. His shoulders sagged as silence reclaimed him. Mrs. Johnson's eyes softened, though her voice grew firmer. "Children may forget a punishment or even a harsh word, but they never forget being made to feel less loved than another. Emily deserves the same care, the same pride, as Michael. Not more, not less, just equal." For a long moment, the kitchen was filled only with the ticking of the wall clock and the bubbling of the stew on the stove. The weight of the silence pressed down heavier than any argument. Finally, Linda forced a thin smile. "We'll consider what you've said." Robert shifted uncomfortably, his gaze drifting to the floor. "Thank you," he mumbled, barely audible. Mrs. Johnson rose, collecting her folder. At the doorway, she paused, her eyes meeting Robert's. Don't underestimate the harm that comes from neglect. Indifference can cut deeper than anger. The words lingered in the room, long after she stepped out into the cool Vermont evening. The door shut with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through the house. Linda returned to the kitchen without another word, stirring the stew with quick, sharp motions. Robert moved toward the back porch, his hand fumbling for a cigarette, the lighter's flame reflecting briefly in his weary eyes. In the hallway, Emily stayed pressed against the wall, frozen. Her lips trembled as she whispered to herself, "I wish someone would defend me here at home." Outside, the sky had grown heavy with gray clouds, the autumn air carrying the promise of rain. Inside, silence thickened, each family member retreating into their separate corners, carrying unspoken truths that weighed more with every passing minute. Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in Emily's mind, clinging to her like the last warmth of the sun before the storm. Children never forget feeling less loved. The sky over Burlington had turned heavy with clouds by the time school let out the next day. The air smelled of damp leaves, and a sharp wind rattled the branches bare. By the time the final bell rang, a light drizzle had already begun to fall, darkening the sidewalks and filling the air with the hiss of rain on pavement. Children spilled out of Champlain Elementary in their colorful jackets, some laughing as they lifted umbrellas, others squealing as they raced through puddles with their backpacks bouncing behind them. Their voices filled the gray afternoon with a brightness that defied the weather. Emily stepped out last, clutching her worn notebook to her chest. She had no umbrella, no jacket thick enough for the chill. The drizzle quickly soaked through her faded dress, turning it darker, the fabric clinging uncomfortably against her thin frame. Her shoes, already too small, let water seep in through the cracked soles until her socks squished with every step. She pulled her sweater tight across her chest, but it was no use. The cold slid in anyway, biting against her skin. She hurried down the stone steps, trying to keep her head low so no one would see her shivering. Down the street, Michael darted out from the building with two of his friends. They laughed, tossing a soccer ball back and forth as they ran for cover beneath the wide awning of a corner shop. Michael shook the water from his hair, grinning as his friends teased each other about the weather. From where he stood, he caught sight of Emily in the distance, her small figure bent against the rain, her dress plastered to her knees, her hair streaming wet across her face. Something inside him tightened. For a moment, his smile faltered. One of his friends nudged him. "Come on, Michael. Let's run through the puddles before the rain gets worse." Michael hesitated. His eyes flickered between his sister, trudging down the sidewalk alone, and the friends tugging at his sleeve. He shifted on his feet, torn between the safety of laughter and the pull of something heavier. Emily kept walking, her notebook clutched to her chest, her small body trembling from the cold. Each step splashed in the growing puddles, and she bit down hard to keep her teeth from chattering. She thought of home, of warmth, but even that image brought no comfort. There would be no blanket waiting, no mother rushing to meet her at the door. The drizzle thickened into a steady rain, pelting the rooftops and rattling the gutters. Emily's legs ached as she quickened her pace, the water soaking her socks until they clung icy against her skin. Her chest burned with the effort of holding in the tears that threatened to spill. Behind her, Michael took a single step out from under the awning, his sneakers splashing in the shallow water. He opened his mouth, almost calling her name, but then his friends laughed again, tugging him back, and he stayed where he was. Emily turned the corner, vanishing into the curtain of rain. By the time Emily reached the Parker home, the rain was falling in heavy sheets. She pushed the door open, shivering as water dripped from her hair onto the wooden floor. Her dress clung to her skin, and her hands were icy cold. Linda glanced up from the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand. Steam rose from the pot, filling the kitchen with the smell of stew. Her expression barely changed. "Go upstairs and change," she said briskly, turning back to stir. Emily nodded, her voice too small to answer. She climbed the stairs slowly, her wet shoes leaving dark prints across the steps. Once in her room, she closed the door and leaned against it, her breath coming in sharp bursts. She peeled off the soaked dress, hung it over the chair, and pulled on an old nightgown that smelled faintly of mothballs. She sat on the edge of her bed, hugging her knees, listening to the muted voices drifting from downstairs. Michael arrived minutes later, his laughter fading the moment he stepped inside. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped him, but his eyes immediately searched for his sister. He heard the creak of floorboards upstairs, followed by the faint sound of a door shutting. He swallowed hard, guilt sitting heavy in his chest. Robert sat quietly at the table, a cigarette unlit between his fingers, as if he wasn't sure whether to strike the match. His gaze lingered on Linda, then drifted to the ceiling above, where Emily's room lay. He wanted to ask about her, wanted to say something, but, as always, the words dissolved before they could reach his lips. Dinner was served in silence. The stew steamed in the bowls. The breadbasket sat in the middle of the table, yet the meal felt heavy, lifeless. Emily appeared late, her hair still damp, her eyes downcast. She sat across from Michael, her spoon barely moving through the broth. Michael shifted uncomfortably, twirling his fork without eating. He wanted to speak, to say he was sorry for leaving her in the rain, for not stepping in when the other children laughed. But the words caught in his throat, stuck fast. He watched her cheeks, still flushed from the cold, and the way she held her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Robert noticed too. His chest tightened, but he only cleared his throat and sipped his water. The fear of conflict with Linda kept him silent once again. The tick of the wall clock filled the room. The sound of rain against the windows seemed louder, harsher. Each family member sat wrapped in their own silence, the distance between them stretching wider than the table itself. After dinner, Robert stepped out to the porch, finally lighting his cigarette. The ember glowed faintly in the dark, his eyes fixed on the storm clouds above. Linda busied herself in the kitchen, humming faintly as she washed the dishes. Michael lingered at the bottom of the stairs, his hand on the banister, staring upward. Upstairs, behind her closed door, Emily lay curled beneath a thin blanket. The steady rhythm of raindrops against the glass echoed the rhythm of her sobs. She pressed her face into the pillow, trying to muffle the sound. Michael crept up the steps, pausing outside her door. He could hear her quiet crying. He pressed his forehead against the wood, his fists clenched. But fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of his mother overhearing kept him frozen. He turned away, retreating to his room. That night, long after the storm had passed, Emily still lay awake. Her eyes were red, her body shivering beneath the blanket. She whispered into the dark, a plea too fragile for anyone else to hear. I wish someone would stand up for me. The golden light of late afternoon spilled through the tall windows of Champlain Elementary's main hall. Rows of wooden benches had been set in neat lines, their varnished surfaces polished by years of use. On the walls hung colorful drawings, houses with red roofs, stick-figure families, wide green fields under bright blue skies. The room smelled faintly of chalk, dust, and coffee, a mixture that carried the comforting weight of routine. Parents filtered in slowly, their conversations blending into a steady hum. Some held paper cups of coffee, others nibbled on cookies set out on a table near the entrance. Coats damp from the recent rain were draped across chairbacks. There was laughter in the air, small bursts of pride as parents spoke about their children's progress, their achievements, their bright futures. Linda Parker entered with Michael at her side, her stride purposeful. She wore a tailored navy coat, her purse clutched firmly under her arm. Her lips were pressed in a polite smile, though her eyes darted quickly around the room, measuring and comparing. Michael followed, chin raised, his new jacket buttoned neatly. He scanned the faces of his classmates' parents, hoping they saw him the way his mother did, confident, important, already on a path to success. Robert trailed behind, his steps slower, his shoulders hunched slightly, as though weighed down by an invisible burden. He kept his hands in his pockets, nodding quietly to the familiar faces he passed, but avoiding conversation. He was a man used to silence, and gatherings like this only deepened the shadows in his chest. Emily slipped into the room behind them. She held her notebook close, her small frame swallowed by the oversized cardigan she wore. She moved to the farthest bench, her steps tentative, her eyes cast down. She sat quietly, folding her hands in her lap, as though trying to disappear into the polished wood. At the front of the hall stood Mrs. Johnson. She greeted parents warmly, shaking hands, thanking them for coming. When the chatter softened, she stepped to the podium. Her clear, steady voice carried easily through the room. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today. It means so much for our children to see that we are united in supporting them. She began with notes of progress, how the class had improved in reading, how several students had taken leadership in group projects, how friendships had flourished. Parents nodded, smiling proudly, some leaning close to their children with whispered praise. Then she began to name individual students. Michael Parker, she said, her eyes lifting briefly toward the family. Michael has shown remarkable responsibility this semester. He demonstrates leadership in games and group work, and he approaches his assignments with diligence. Linda's smile widened. She sat taller, her hand brushing Michael's shoulder with pride. Michael straightened even more, cheeks glowing as the room acknowledged him with a soft ripple of approval. Emily shrank further into her seat, her hands tightening around her notebook. She felt her chest ache with a familiar heaviness, the sense that once again she would remain invisible. But then Mrs. Johnson paused. She glanced at her notes, then lifted her head with a different tone in her voice, one carrying both warmth and intent. "There is another student I'd like to recognize," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room before landing on the small figure in the back row. "Emily Parker." A soft murmur spread across the room. Parents shifted in their seats, surprised to hear the name of the quiet little girl who so often faded into the background. Emily's eyes widened. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. But then she saw Mrs. Johnson smiling directly at her, and her heart began to pound in her chest. She lowered her gaze quickly, cheeks burning. "Emily," Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice steady, "has shown a quiet but remarkable dedication to her work. She doesn't draw attention to herself, yet her writing reveals a sensitivity and depth unusual for her age. In math, she has solved problems that challenge even the strongest students. And beyond her studies, she notices details. Others overlook an empathy that shines through in small acts of kindness." A hush fell over the hall. Parents turned, many looking at Emily with newfound respect. A few offered small smiles, others nodded softly, as if acknowledging a truth they hadn't seen before. Linda stiffened in her seat. Her proud smile for Michael had faded into a tight line. She glanced quickly at Robert, whose eyes were fixed on their daughter at the back of the hall. His expression was unreadable, but his throat worked as though swallowing back something heavy. Emily sat frozen, her notebook clutched tightly against her chest. She wanted to disappear, and yet, at the same time, a fragile warmth began to unfurl inside her. For the first time, someone had said her name aloud in front of everyone. Someone had seen her. Mrs. Johnson let the silence linger, then spoke again, this time more broadly. "Our children thrive when they feel loved and valued. It isn't enough to provide food or shelter. They need to know, every day, that their presence matters." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling, striking deep into the hearts of the parents gathered. The room was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers and the creak of wooden benches. Linda crossed her arms, her jaw set. Her thoughts churned, but she said nothing. Robert, however, leaned forward slightly, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, an urgency that had long been buried beneath silence. Emily dared to lift her gaze. For just a heartbeat, her eyes met Mrs. Johnson's, and the warmth in the teacher's look nearly undid her. She ducked her head again, but the glow inside her remained. The meeting continued with other names, other praises, yet the air still carried the echo of Emily's recognition. As families began to rise, offering thanks to the teacher, a few stopped by Emily's bench. "Well done, sweetheart," an older woman whispered kindly. "You should be proud," another parent added with a smile. Emily blushed deeply, unable to speak, but she nodded faintly. As the Parker family left the school, the chill of evening air wrapped around them. The plaza outside buzzed with conversation, laughter spilling from groups of parents and children walking together. The scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor drifted on the breeze. Linda walked stiffly, her purse pressed tightly against her side. Robert followed, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his thoughts restless. Emily trailed behind, her steps light despite the cold, as though she were walking in a dream. For the first time, the world felt a little less heavy. But inside Linda's chest, Mrs. Johnson's words echoed with a persistence she could not shake. They need to know, every day, that their presence matters. Sunday mornings in Burlington had a way of painting the town in gold. The church bells rang from the steeple, their echoes drifting across the square. Families poured into the market, scarves wrapped tight, boots clicking on the cobblestones. The air smelled of cinnamon pastries fresh from the bakery. of roasted peanuts sold in paper cones, of hot apple cider steaming in wooden barrels. Vendors called out cheerfully from their booths. Fresh maple syrup, Vermont's finest. Wool scarves, hand-knitted, perfect for the cold. Try our pumpkin bread just out of the oven. The Parker family walked among the crowd. For the first time in weeks, Linda held Emily's hand as they moved between the stalls. The gesture was small, but it made Emily's heart flutter. She kept glancing up at her mother's face, unsure if she dared to trust this sudden kindness. Michael walked ahead, kicking a pebble along the cobblestones, while Robert carried the basket, his hands firm on the handle, his expression unreadable. They passed a stand selling polished apples, another with jars of golden honey catching the light. Emily's eyes darted everywhere, drinking in the sights and sounds. She loved the market, but she often felt it wasn't for her. It was for families who laughed freely, who bought their children sweets and toys without hesitation. For her, the market usually meant walking behind, clutching her old cardigan, watching Michael get something new while she was told to be patient. But today felt different. They stopped at a stall filled with dresses. Bolts of cloth swayed gently in the autumn breeze, their colors rich and alive. Scarlet, emerald, soft ivory, and sky blue embroidered with flowers. Emily's breath caught. She stood still, her eyes wide, her hand tightening in her mother's grasp. The vendor, a kindly man with graying hair and a booming voice, smiled warmly. "Good morning, ma'am. You're in luck. These just came in from Boston. Finest quality you'll find this side of the river." Linda paused. She scanned the rows of dresses, her eyes narrowing, calculating. For a moment, her old self seemed to flicker, the woman who measured worth by appearances, who thought only of Michael's place in the world. But then she looked down at Emily, her daughter's small hand still pressed in hers. The cardigan Emily wore was frayed at the cuffs, its color faded, the buttons mismatched. Linda's chest tightened. She bent down to Emily's level, her voice unusually soft. "Which one do you like, sweetheart?" Emily froze. The market's noise seemed to vanish. Her lips parted, but no words came. No one had ever asked her that before, not here, not anywhere. She looked at her mother, searching for a trick, some hidden edge. But Linda's face, though strained, was open. Michael grinned, nudging her gently. "Go on, Emily. Pick one." Emily's hand trembled as she raised it. She pointed toward the sky blue dress with white embroidered flowers. It hung gracefully on the rack, swaying as if calling only to her. The vendor lifted it carefully, holding it against Emily's small frame. He nodded approvingly. "Perfect fit. She'll look lovely." Robert reached into his wallet without hesitation. "We'll take it." His voice carried a note of firmness, almost pride. Emily gasped as the fabric brushed her hands. She held it tightly, tracing the flowers with her fingertips, as if they were the most delicate treasures she had ever touched. Her eyes shimmered with something new hope. The vendor ushered her behind a wooden screen to change. Emily's hand shook as she slipped out of her old cardigan and stepped into the new dress. When she looked into the cracked mirror, she barely recognized herself. The color made her eyes seem brighter, her smile gentler, her whole body lighter. She stepped out slowly. The sunlight caught the blue threads, making them sparkle. The crowd hushed. "She looks beautiful," whispered an older woman nearby. "Like a little princess," another added, smiling. Emily's cheeks flushed pink. She lowered her gaze shyly, but the corners of her lips curved upward in the faintest, most fragile smile. For a long moment, the market seemed to stop moving. The fiddler's tune played on. The smell of roasted chestnuts lingered in the air. But all eyes were on the little girl in blue. Emily turned slowly, clutching the hem of the dress. She felt the fabric sway gently with the breeze, as if it belonged to a life she had only ever imagined. Michael clapped lightly, a wide grin on his face. "See, Emily? I told you it'd be perfect." Robert's lips curved into a small smile, rare, quiet, but unmistakably proud. His hands stayed tucked in his coat pockets, but in his chest, something loosened. He realized how long it had been since he had seen his daughter stand tall. Linda stood still, her heart caught between pride and regret. For years she had brushed Emily aside with words like "not now" or "Michael needs it more." But now, seeing the tears shimmer in her daughter's eyes, she felt her own throat tighten. She reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from Emily's forehead. "You look beautiful, darling," she whispered, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Emily froze at the sound of those words. Beautiful. No one had ever called her that before. She blinked rapidly, then threw her arms around her mother's waist. Linda hesitated for only a second before wrapping her arms around the little girl, awkward but genuine. The vendor smiled knowingly, lowering his voice. "She'll never forget this day. Neither will you." Robert paid without a word, surprising even himself by not bargaining, not hesitating. For once, he knew the value of what they were buying went far beyond the fabric. As they walked through the square, the mood felt transformed. Emily refused to take off the dress, skipping lightly beside her mother, who kept her hand firmly in hers. Michael hummed along with the fiddler's tune, his steps bouncing. Robert trailed just behind, watching them, feeling a warmth in his chest that reminded him of another time when laughter had once filled this family. That evening, the Parkers sat around the dinner table. The stew steamed in bowls, bread sat warm in a basket, and for the first time in months, the house rang with gentle laughter. Michael told a clumsy joke from school, and even Linda laughed. Emily giggled so hard she nearly spilled her drink. But instead of scolding, Linda only shook her head, smiling softly. After dinner, Emily wandered into the hallway mirror. She turned side to side, watching the blue fabric shimmer. She placed her hands on her waist and tilted her head, studying the girl who looked back at her. Was that really her? Upstairs, Robert lingered near the doorway with Linda. For once, silence didn't feel like avoidance. It was full, almost comfortable. Linda's eyes softened as she watched Emily twirl. "I might have been wrong," she murmured. "About more than just clothes." Robert glanced at her, surprised, then nodded slowly. He wanted to say more, but the words weren't ready yet. When bedtime came, Emily climbed into bed, still wearing the dress, hugging the fabric against her chest. She whispered into the quiet room, her eyes heavy but her heart light. "Maybe I do matter." And for the first time in her young life, she drifted to sleep with a smile, while the autumn wind rattled gently against the windows like a lullaby. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Champlain Elementary, casting warm golden rectangles across the polished wooden floor. The smell of chalk dust lingered, mixed with the faint aroma of brewed coffee set out on a table at the back of the assembly hall. Folding chairs creaked as parents settled into place, conversations humming quietly like bees. On the walls hung the children's artwork, bright crayon sketches of autumn trees, barns, family homes with smoke curling from chimneys. For the older parents in the room, those pictures were like glimpses into their own memories, years long gone but not forgotten. Robert Parker sat stiffly in the second row, his hands clasped together, his eyes distant. He had never been fond of school meetings, but today felt different. The memory of Emily spinning in her new blue dress still haunted him, not in a painful way, but as a reminder of what he had almost missed. His daughter's laughter at dinner had been so rare, so precious, that it left an ache in his chest. Linda sat beside him, her purse tight against her lap. Her expression was composed, her posture perfect, but her fingers tapped nervously against the leather strap. Michael leaned casually against his chair, already whispering about his recent soccer game to a friend across the aisle. And Emily, sweet, quiet Emily, sat close to her father, clutching her notebook as though it were a shield. At the front of the room, Mrs. Johnson stood poised. She cleared her throat gently, and the low hum of conversation faded. "Good evening, friends. Tonight, we gather not only to talk about grades and assignments, but about the hearts behind those papers. Because our children are more than scores on a page, they are stories waiting to be told." Her voice carried warmth, steady and clear, and even the restless children in the back stilled to listen. She began with recognition of several students, those who had improved in reading, others who showed leadership in group projects. Parents smiled, nodded, exchanged quiet glances of pride. Then Mrs. Johnson's eyes found Michael. Michael Parker has demonstrated strong leadership during class activities and has been responsible with his work. Linda's lips curved upward. She gave Michael a quick pat on the arm, whispering, "That's my boy." Michael puffed his chest slightly, enjoying the ripple of attention. But then the teacher paused, her gaze shifting toward the back row where Emily sat, almost hidden. Her tone softened, yet carried even more weight. "There is another student I must mention, Emily Parker." The room hushed. A few parents tilted their heads, curious. Robert felt his pulse quicken. He looked down at his daughter, who was already shrinking into her chair. her cheeks flushed. "Emily," Mrs. Johnson continued, "is quiet in class. She doesn't seek the spotlight. But her writing reveals a remarkable sensitivity, and her mathematical work shows determination far beyond her years. She notices details others overlook. And what strikes me most is her empathy, her ability to see the feelings of others and respond with kindness." The silence deepened, as though the room itself was leaning closer to listen. Emily stared down at her notebook, her knuckles white around its edges. She didn't want to cry. Not here, not in front of everyone. But her heart swelled with a warmth she couldn't contain. Robert blinked hard, his throat tightening. For years, he had convinced himself that silence was safer than speaking, that avoiding conflict with Linda was the only way to keep peace. But as he listened to Mrs. Johnson speak of Emily, pride and sorrow tangled within him. He realized he had failed his daughter by standing aside. Linda shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms. She felt the eyes of other parents on her, and for the first time, shame pricked sharp against her pride. Mrs. Johnson's voice rang steady. "Our children flourish not just when they are fed and clothed, but when they are seen, when they know they matter." The words hung in the air like a bell's echo, sinking into every corner of the room. A few parents shifted uneasily. Others bowed their heads as though the truth in Mrs. Johnson's words struck too close to home. Emily dared to lift her eyes. For just a heartbeat, she met her teacher's gaze, a look full of encouragement, as if to say, "You are seen. You are enough." The warmth of it burned through her chest, leaving her breathless. Linda sat rigid, her jaw tight. A faint flush crept along her cheeks, but she forced her lips into a thin smile, pretending not to notice the way eyes around the room glanced at her. Inside, however, Mrs. Johnson's words gnawed, sharp and relentless. Robert, meanwhile, could no longer keep his composure. His hands trembled slightly where they rested on his knees. He remembered Emily standing in the rain just days earlier, her small shoulders shaking, her dress soaked through. He remembered her laugh at dinner when she wore the blue dress. And he remembered every moment of silence where he should have spoken but didn't. His throat ached with unspoken words. For the first time, he saw silence not as peace, but as betrayal. Mrs. Johnson closed her notes, her eyes scanning the parents once more. "Let us remember," she said softly, "that what we do or fail to do becomes the memories our children carry for life." Applause broke out, polite at first, then growing into something stronger. Parents whispered to one another, some dabbing their eyes, others nodding firmly. Robert clapped too, but his palm stung with the force of it. He wasn't clapping for the speech. He was clapping to drown out the guilt roaring in his ears. Emily tucked her notebook closer, her small shoulders curling inward again. But somewhere deep inside, a seed had been planted, the sense that she wasn't invisible after all. As the meeting ended, families began to file out into the cool evening. Voices rose in cheerful chatter. Children tugged at sleeves, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted in from the plaza. The Parkers walked in silence. Linda's heels clicked sharply against the pavement, her lips pressed tight. Michael swung his backpack over his shoulder, humming faintly, already half absorbed in his own world. Emily lagged a step behind, her eyes still glowing faintly from Mrs. Johnson's praise. Robert walked in the middle, his hands deep in his coat pockets. His heart was heavy, but in that weight was also a decision forming, slow but firm. For years he had hidden in silence. But silence had cost too much already. As they reached the corner of the plaza, Linda stopped abruptly, staring down at the cobblestones. The words of Mrs. Johnson still echoed in her mind, persistent and unforgiving. "Our children flourish when they feel seen." For the first time, doubt cracked her certainty. Sunday dawned bright and clear. The storm of the week before now, just a memory. The bells from Street Mary's rang across Burlington, their chimes folding into the laughter of children running through the square. Vendors once again filled the plaza, laying out fruit, cheese, bolts of fabric, and sweet treats. The air smelled of roasted peanuts, maple syrup, and warm bread. But in the Parker household, the morning felt different. Linda moved slowly in the kitchen, her hands brushing over the edge of the table as if to steady herself. The words from Mrs. Johnson still haunted her. They had followed her home, echoed in her sleep, whispered in her heart. Our children flourish when they feel loved and valued. Robert sat at the table with a newspaper folded in his lap, but he hadn't turned a page in half an hour. He kept glancing at the stairs, listening for the light footsteps of Emily. Michael lounged on the couch, flipping a soccer ball from hand to hand, his energy restless. Finally, Emily appeared. She wore the blue dress, the hem brushed against her knees, the embroidery catching the sunlight streaming through the window. Her smile was timid, but it was there a quiet glow that seemed to fill the whole room. "Good morning, sweetheart," Robert said, his voice low but warm. Emily blinked in surprise. Her father rarely spoke first, and even more rarely with such gentleness. She smiled faintly. "Good morning, Daddy." Linda's hand stilled over the table. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, then cleared her throat. "Sit down, Emily. Breakfast's ready." The meal passed quietly, but the silence was not heavy like before. It was fragile, like a bridge just beginning to form. Later that day, Linda suggested something no one expected. "Why don't we have dinner together tonight? Just us. A proper family dinner." Michael looked up in surprise. "Like, all of us?" "Yes," Linda replied, her voice firmer now. "All of us." By evening, the table was set with more care than usual. A roast chicken steamed at the center, surrounded by roasted potatoes, fresh rolls, and a small dish of jam Robert had bought from the market. Candles flickered gently, their light softening the edges of the room. As the family gathered, Emily's heart pounded. She had dreamed of nights like this, but had never dared to believe they could be real. Robert poured a little wine for himself and Linda, while Michael filled glasses of milk for himself and Emily. Linda moved around the table, her hands slightly trembling as she placed each dish. When they finally sat, a silence fell. Not the silence of indifference, but of something waiting, something fragile, ready to break or to blossom. Robert looked at Emily, then at Linda. He cleared his throat, his voice steady, though thick with emotion. "I think it's time we stop pretending everything's fine. Our daughter deserves more than scraps of attention." Linda's fork clinked against her plate. Her eyes met his, sharp at first, then softening. Emily froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the future hanging in the balance. For a long while, no one moved. The only sounds were the faint crackle of the candles and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Linda's eyes stayed locked on Robert's, her lips pressed tightly together. She wanted to argue, to defend the choices she had made. But the memory of Emily's soaked dress in the rain, the whispers of other parents at the meeting, and the look of quiet gratitude in her daughter's eyes when she wore the blue dress, all of it came rushing back. Her shoulders sank. She set down her fork and, in a voice unsteady but sincere, said, "You're right. I've been wrong, Robert. I've been wrong for a long time." Emily's breath caught. She glanced between her parents, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. Linda turned to her daughter, her eyes glistening. "Emily, I'm sorry, sweetheart. Sorry for making you feel invisible. Sorry for forgetting that you deserve joy as much as anyone else." The little girl's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the edge of her dress, her voice trembling. "I thought maybe I didn't matter." Oh, you matter," Robert said firmly, leaning forward, his hands gripping the table as if anchoring himself. His eyes were wet now, his voice breaking. "You matter more than I've ever shown. And I promise you, I won't stay silent anymore." Michael shifted uncomfortably, guilt flashing across his young face. He had laughed with his friends while Emily was teased, had stayed quiet when he should have defended her. He swallowed hard, then reached across the table, his hand brushing Emily's. "I'm sorry too," he whispered. "I should have been a better brother." Emily looked at him, her lips trembling, and then slowly she smiled. She placed her small hand over his, accepting his apology without words. For the first time in years, the Parkers shared not just a meal, but a moment of truth. The walls that silence had built began to crumble, brick by brick. After dinner, Emily stayed seated, her blue dress spread across the chair, the candlelight dancing across her face. Linda knelt beside her, brushing a hand through her daughter's hair with a tenderness that had been missing for too long. "I can't change the past, Emily," she murmured, her voice thick with regret. "But I can promise you this, I will never let you feel unseen again." Emily's tears spilled over as she leaned into her mother's embrace. Robert placed a hand gently on Linda's shoulder, and for the first time in many years, they felt like a family imperfect, but mending. That night, as Emily climbed into bed, she held the dress against her chest like a treasure. Her eyes closed, her heart light. For once, her dreams were not of longing, but of belonging. Downstairs, Robert and Linda sat quietly on the porch. The autumn wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke from neighboring houses. Robert reached for Linda's hand, their fingers intertwining. "Maybe it's not too late," he said softly. Linda squeezed his hand, her eyes misty but steady. It's never too late." Inside, the candles had burned low, their glow fading. But the warmth of that night, the night forgiveness was spoken aloud, would remain in their home forever. There are nights when silence speaks louder than words, and sometimes it takes just one meal, one embrace, one honest apology to change the course of a family story. In the Parker home, the glow of candlelight on that Sunday evening did not just illuminate a table, it revealed the possibility of healing, of love rediscovered. If you followed Emily's journey through these chapters, perhaps you felt the same stirring in your heart, the ache of neglect, the quiet strength of a child who longed to be seen, and the fragile, powerful moment when forgiveness was finally spoken aloud. Friends, if you found beauty in this story, leave a number 1 in the comments. If you think it could have been told better, or have a thought to add, please share with a 0 and let us know your heart. What lesson does this simple tale carry? That unconditional love can mend what years of silence have broken. That every soul, whether a child, a parent, or even an aging grandfather rocking slowly on his porch, deserves to feel cherished. Love, not wealth, builds the kind of legacy that lasts. Money can buy a new dress, but only tenderness can transform it into a memory a child carries forever. Just as many of you remember holiday dinners where laughter filled the kitchen, or those quiet moments when your parents tucked you in after a long day, it is the kindness woven into those gestures that endures. Life teaches us, again and again, that happiness is found not in living for ourselves, but in giving ourselves away to those we love. Think of it this way, like a lamp quietly shining in a farmhouse window on a snowy Vermont night. A small act of kindness has the power to guide someone home through their darkest paths. Perhaps it's as simple as calling your grown children just to hear their voices, or setting an extra plate at the table when a neighbor has no one else. These are not grand gestures, but they are the stitches that hold a family quilt together. And when you look back, as so many of us do in our later years, you'll see that it was never the big moments of success or recognition that defined us. It was the ordinary kindnesses, repeated faithfully, that gave shape and warmth to our lives. So, as we close this story, let it be more than a tale about one little girl and her family. Let it be an invitation. Take a moment tonight to sit with your memories. Ask yourself, who in your life may still be waiting for a word of love, a gesture of forgiveness, a sign that they matter? The answer may surprise you. And if this story touched your heart, I encourage you to share it, not just by telling others, but by living it out. After all, when we carry love into our homes, our friendships, even into the way we greet strangers on a Sunday morning, we pass on a light that will never fade.